the omnipotent of capitalism, the omnipotent of wealth and power is something that's not going to be changed overnight with just community wealth building. You need to keep going and going and going. What gives me hope is that whenever community wealth building is introduced and you're seeing some of the returns, some of the benefits, people think this is the way it should be. This is common sense. And so you're hoping that that grows to an extent where it becomes the new common sense, more universal. And it starts saying, no, we don't need to do that egregious big data center. We're going to do this. So I just think we're still in the foothills, but at least we're starting to climb, I think. And it'll be a constant struggle all the way up to the top. We've got systemic problems. It needs systemic change.
Welcome to the Changing the Narrative podcast. This is an independent platform for challenging the prevailing narrative about how our economies and societies have to work, talking to people helping to build the alternatives. I want to help not just raise awareness about the alternatives, but understand how they function and how they can be replicated and expanded. To open this first series of conversations, I'm joined by Neil McInroy. Neil's an economist who spent the best part of 30 years working on alternatives to an extractive economy. He helped carry an idea called community wealth building from a single experiment in Cleveland, Ohio in the US into practice in the UK, most visibly in Preston. And he now works with the Democracy Collaborative, the American organization that coined the term. Community wealth building starts with a question about wealth itself. Who holds it, where it goes, and whether it stays in a place or gets pulled out of it. The aim is to build local economies where wealth lands and circulates rather than being pulled out. Through things like cooperatives, fair and better paid work, community-owned land and energy, and public bodies spending closer to home. And the reason we're talking now is that Scotland has just put that idea into law. The Community Wealth Building Act, passed earlier this year in February 2026, is the first national legislation of its kind anywhere in the world. So this is a story about something moving from the margins to the statute book. What it took to get there, what it actually changes for people, and what comes next. One thing before we start, Changing the Narrative is independent and ad-free and relies on paying members to make it sustainable. Following is free, getting you access to all the core podcasts, articles, and photo stories, but if you're able to support Changing the Narrative as a paying member, that genuinely is what keeps it going. Either way, you can sign up at content.changingthenarrative.media. Here's my conversation with Neil. Enjoy. For someone who's never come across community wealth building before, how would you best describe it?
If a joiner or a carpenter works with wood, an economist works with wealth and flows of wealth. It's the medium we work in. Wealth is a defining feature of all economies. Who has it? Where does it go? How does people get their hands on it? How is it acting virtuously? To what extent is it retained within localities or extracted? These questions, these patterns are fundamental. What community wealth building does is says, hold on, we're going to create patterns of wealth where local people, local communities, local environment, local context matters. It's not peripatetic. It makes wealth land, stick, be retained and circulated. And by landing and being circulated, it nourishes the economic and social environmental life of place. So it's basically new patterns of wealth which disrupt and seek to change the extractive forms of wealth and the egregious forms of wealth that is killing the planet.
And so in terms of then the inertia that exists that you've mentioned in the bureaucratic arena, and then also those forces that are influencing that and influencing the economy in terms of the vested interests and the capitalist class, essentially. How is community wealth building going to effectively counter that and challenge that and allow, what's going to happen? How is it going to create that change that it seeks to create?
I'll get into the real practical elements at the end of this comment, but firstly, it's worth saying that the theory of change is well thought through on community wealth building. And it has a tactic called evolutionary reconstruction, which seeks to actually amplify and scale the good things that are there anyway. The little snippets of excellent stuff, like community land trusts, like co-ops, it seeks to try and grow those. And how it does this is it splits up the economy, what we like to think about the different flows of wealth into 5 main pillars of wealth. And these are fairly standard in terms of how one thinks about how an economy works and where wealth goes. One is work. So you look to actually create work which is well paid, good terms and conditions, good living wage. So it's about traditional labour market policies which make work pay. The second area or pipe is procurement. It looks at the role of large anchor institutions, large public bodies, and what goods and services they buy, looking to buy more from social firms, local firms, firms who have not just looking at the bottom line in terms of shareholder dividend, but looking at wider virtuous activities as an economic entity. So it's about procurement. Where do you buy your goods and services from, particularly those large public institutions? The third thing it looks at is finance. It's a huge source of wealth. It looks at how do we create financial systems and financial ecosystems where it's community finance, recirculation of wealth within places, public banks, the progressive use of pension funds. So it looks at the financial architecture to make it relate to a place and to people and communities. The fourth area is land and property. Clearly a huge source of wealth. We look to democratise land and property, where municipal ownership, cooperative ownership, community land trusts and so forth. The very nature of the land that we stand on, we believe should be more democratised and owned by us, the people, citizenry. So the whole range of things you can put in place there. And the final pillar, and the most important one, is inclusive ownership. This is where we support development trust, cooperatives, employee ownership, state ownership, social enterprises. All those business forms, by their very nature, are regenerative. They allow wealth to be flowed and retained either by the workers or by the community. And so they are, by their very nature, community wealth builders. So we seek to advance them. So we have these 5 pillars, finance, procurement, land and property assets, work, and this inclusive ownership pillar. And we'd look to put in tactics, I'd look to put in policies and practice that actually advances all 5 of those pillars. That's the practical element to CWB.
And so the Democracy Collaborative, which is the organization you currently work for, based in the US, they conceived the phrase community wealth building. And so they've been nurturing that for the past 20 years, roughly. And so what exactly connects Cleveland Evergreen cooperatives in the US, say, and then Preston in England, which is a model, one of the original models in the UK, and then now Scotland, which has recently passed the Community Wealth Building Act?
Yeah, what we've seen in 20 years from the origins of community wealth building in Cleveland, which was the test bed, the first test bed, and I suppose its USP, its unique element, its unique facet then as a test bed, was it sort of said, how do we make sure in this Rust Belt town that's lost half its population and this huge urban dereliction and poverty, how do we make sure that the wealth we have in this place could be redirected towards more citizens? There was hospitals, there was local authorities, there was some element of happening in the economy in terms of wealth generation or economic production activity. How can we redirect certain parts of that? And so it was the conceptualization of reconfiguring the wealth that was in a place to actually work for poorer folks within Cleveland. And that's where they set up the Evergreen Co-ops as a laundry to provide a laundry facility for the Cleveland Clinic, a large hospital. And they took the contract off a large multinational, Sodexo, and that laundry facility is still working today. It was a test bed. It was around procuring of goods and services and the building of a co-op in relation to that need for a laundry service that could compete and win contracts. That was a test bed, and I became aware of that test bed around the time I was talking about earlier, in the mid-noughties, maybe a little bit later, and it made me start thinking about patterns of wealth. Then I, through the organisation I was working for at the time, Centre for Local Economic Strategies, sought to adopt some of those principles within the UK. We initially did a study in Belfast around developing something similar to the Cleveland model. That, for many reasons, didn't take off. We did look to explore it to be a project in Manchester, which is a very large, complicated city, and it felt it was not an appropriate test bed. And then so we landed on Preston as a relatively small city of 150,000 people. And we adopted an anchor approach in that city with 6 anchors to procure more goods and services for those anchors with local firms or with cooperatives and social firms within that locality. Subsequently, there was a number of other areas that picked up on that. We did community upbuild work in London Borough, Islington, Torbay, Sunderland, Hartlepool in England, and then eventually it kind of rocked up to Scotland, which I'm sure we can talk about. And subsequently, there's been a range of different places across the world now who have picked up on community wealth building with the 5-pillar model, including St. Louis in Missouri, Denver in Colorado, Chicago in the USA partly, Sydney in Australia, Amsterdam, and also quite an extensive program of community wealth building now in South Korea. There's 3 cities there that are taken on board CWB. Hope there's a little snapshot.
I think that has expanded the way that it has, for sure. But going back to the Preston model from 2013, I believe, like how did that conversation come about? How did you get in the room with the councillors, the 2 councillors that went on to agree to adopt it, and what made them so receptive to it?
Yeah, good question. There's a long story about the marriage, if you like, between Centre for Local Economic Strategy, myself, and Preston. First, the thing to say though is that Preston were a member of the think tank that I was part of. We're a member-based organisation, and Preston were members, and they were aware of our work and interest on wealth and community wealth building. So they were aware of our work, and the political leadership of Preston had suffered a bit of a blow in that their plans for a redevelopment of the city centre had fallen through because of the global financial crisis. It was an Australian pension company who were the anchor investor, and they pulled out of it post GFC, post the global financial crisis. So they were left with a hole, literally a hole, as well as a metaphorical one, in their plans for Preston. And then they thought, well, let's pivot and let's think about this community wealth building as an approach. We met the officers and then met some of the political leadership. And straight away, it was clear that the political leadership were supportive, strong, understood questions of economic democracy, were part forced into a position where they needed to try something else. And also the cabinet member for social exclusion at the time, Councillor Matthew Brown, he was very aware of what had been happening in Cleveland, and also aware of our work at CLES, and also had been to Mondragon and seen other cooperative activity work. So he was right in the zone, if you like. So that meant we had political buy-in, we had officer buy-in in terms of Preston City Council officers. We had an emergent methodology that we developed in Belfast and partly in Manchester. So it was a good marriage, and then so the partnership began between ourselves and Preston City Council.
Okay, and so obviously that was the test bed that you needed then, and it's only grown from there. What have been the catalysts to this uptake and increase in uptake? You know, obviously there's going to be the dimension of witnessing the fact that it's viable through the likes of Preston and Cleveland and other examples. So obviously as the examples of success expand, then the potential for uptake is increased. But also, what about like external forces, like the political environment, the economic environment? What do you think has catalyzed the uptake of community wealth building and the interest in it?
It's a good question again. When I first started on this journey, or at least when I first started before community wealth building, like 30 years ago, let's say back to the kind of mid-90s, I've always been interested in alternative economics, ecological economics, behavioural economics, institutional economics. And I suppose in those days, because there was a period of economic growth, there was a period that there was a social mobility ladder, there was a sense that capitalism was working. I suppose that in those days, I didn't see the wider context being particularly receptive. It was kind of alternative and a bit weird and a bit wacky. And, well, hold on, capitalism works all right. You know what I mean? What are you on about? Yeah, okay, a bit of poverty, but we can redistribute our wealth and, we'll sort that. Now there's an immeasurable change. Even in mainstream political class, your mainstream social democrats, if you like, they know there's a deep, deep problem with how the economy is run and who it runs for, and its effect in terms of fossil fuels and its effect on the climate crisis. So the mask is slipping on the prevailing economic system. And you could even see on the right nowadays, the far right, even they believe the economy is not working for people. Their prescriptions are flawed, but they again can say, oh, no, it's not working right. Cost of living crisis, energy crisis, climate crisis. This is all, something's not going right here. So it's become a lot easier to sell alternative ideas, to talk about wealth, to talk about flows of wealth, to talk about how we can retain more value from economic production, given the nature of peripatetic capital, the nature of huge global corporates. It's all become quite a lot easier. And that's why many, many more people are picking up on community wealth building as a key alternative economic strategy for delivering justice, delivering on poverty, delivering on decency, delivering on innovation and va-va-voom in our economy. So those macro forces are particularly important because the mask has slipped on extractive fossil fuel capitalism and people are looking for alternatives. But as I said before, there's still many, though, who wish to maintain the existing economic system, and they are our worst enemy, really, because they are the ones that will whisper in the ear of politicians, who will lobby politicians to maintain the status quo. And clearly the status quo is taking many people into penury and also destroying the planet. That's a recipe for disaster. But nevertheless, they're still powerful and hanging on as long as they can. In fact, they'll probably hang on to the very last minute before they will probably pivot and change to a different economic system.
So then how does community wealth building, if it is embraced by a city, or in the case of Scotland now, at a country level, if community wealth building is embraced, how does that inoculate or insulate at least that community from the extractive, from the destructive forces of the existing system?
I suppose it because ultimately it's the fifth pillar in ownership, democratic ownership. So that, to have more of a control and a stake directly in economic production, economic activity, or ownership of land is a key bulwark, a key windbreak against peripatetic capital, the ebbs and flows of distant investors. If you own your own house, metaphor, if you own your own house, then it's your house. If you completely, nobody can take it off you, it can't move away. There's an inertia to it, which is really, really important. So that's what community wealth building offers. It offers a bulwark, an inertia to ownership, an inertia to where wealth is landed and where it actually sits, which means it can't be taken away easily and can't move away easily. It's sticky capital, and sticky capital has roots and goes deep and actually starts to grow within that place rather than the nature of a footloose and free global investment market. It takes that egregious corrosive element away. It means that basically the place is run and owned by us, the citizenry, not distant shareholders, distant owners.
So Scotland has just passed the world's first national community wealth building legislation. And so what then should the people of Scotland notice changing in their lives and the communities over the next few years as this is implemented?
The first thing I think about Scotland, I think importantly, is that there's three legs to the stool of its approach. One is there's been a movement of many people that's been arguing for community land trust, land reform, anti-gentrification. So they're all part of the movement. We've also had test beds like the Preston example in a number of locations in local authorities. And now we've got the legislation. What the legislation should do, because we now each local authority in Scotland needs to produce a community wealth building action plan. So that means their economic development approach is going to be based on community wealth building. So they should start to see the redirecting of anchor institutions' pounds more towards local firms, the local social firms included in that. We should start to see the growth of community land trusts and community ownership of land and property within localities. We should start to see new forms of finance, be it community development finance, other forms of recirculated finance initiatives within our localities. We should see the growth of co-ops, the growth of social enterprises, the growth of employee ownership. Scotland also has an associated target, which is to triple the number of cooperatives, employee-owned firms, social enterprises by 2034. So you should see more of our economic activity being run by those ownership forms. We should see more local independence in our high street. We should see living wage, decent wage terms and conditions being more of the norm than it presently is. It's a slow burn, really, but clearly the fact that you've got a strategic plan, community wealth-building plan in each locality, and then a whole range of policies and practices that flow from that across the 5 pillars, we should start to see a difference. We already are seeing significant differences, particularly around community ownership of wind energy renewables in Scotland, where there's a massive exponential growth of community-owned wind farms, which is one example. Some of the communities own the land, then they own the wind turbine, they're setting up these energy production companies. A lot of these are community-owned, or communities have a share in them. I'm already seeing quite significant amount of resources being recirculated back into the local community for use for a whole range of other purposes, including economic development purposes. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I'm danger of over talking it all, but it's a slow burn. Scotland still is a small country, still has huge levels of FDI, still has a mainstream economic development approach, but community wealth building is a large enough alternative with a large enough strategic significance to start to chip away and see more and more of our wealth and our economy being produced by and for us.
What does that look like, though, in the face of AI and data centers? Because, that's obviously, there is still that dependence, as you said, in terms of foreign direct investment. So, and the community wealth building is that slow burn. So, and it's not going to inoculate or insulate from day one. It's going to take time. But obviously, if these data centers are built within Scotland, it's going to be hard to then remove them or address the impact after the fact. So what do you think the future holds in that regard? Because I've just read in a newsletter this morning from Planet Critical that there's one going through planning, Cato it's called, in Fife. And so obviously the existence of community wealth building isn't enough, and it is a framework, as you've said, and it's a slow burn. So maybe I'm muddying the water now.
No.
And confusing things, but that is the future. This is on our doorstep. This is a big thing. How do we address that in the context of community wealth building?
It's a brilliant question, and you're spot on, and it occupies nowadays a lot of my work. How does it relate to these bigger behemoths, if you like, those bigger trajectories of wealth and power, and how does community wealth building not just be seen as like a nice fluffy thing over there, but this is the main stuff, and I think, look, the theory of change of community wealth building is meant for is evolutionary reconstruction. This is about getting toeholds or hooks and barbs inside the existing system. So you've got it, you're hanging on, you've got some community land trusts, you've got some good community wealth building activity, yeah? But that's never enough, you've got to go again. There'll be another, you need to grow the hook and barb. So it's about a constant evolutionary reconstruction of how we're doing things. We've got this foothold in a number of places across the world, including Scotland. There's these bigger forces are still there. It's still to make the movement. You still need the activism. You still need people critiquing. You still need to grow the policy of community wealth building itself and go again and again and again and again. The fight it's restless. It's hard work. There's no resting on laurels. The omnipotent of capitalism, the omnipotent of wealth and power is something that's not going to be changed overnight with just community wealth building. You need to keep going and going and going. And what gives me hope is that whenever community wealth building is introduced and you're seeing some of the returns, some of the benefits, people think this is the way it should be. This is common sense. And so you're hoping that grows to an extent where it becomes the new common sense, more universal. And it starts like saying, no, we don't need to do that egregious big data center. We're going to do this. So I just think we're still in the foothills, but at least we're starting to climb, I think. And it'll be a constant struggle all the way up to the top. we've got systemic problems. It needs systemic change. And then, as I say, we need hooks and barbs inside the system. Community wealth building is one of those hooks and barbs. Let's make it work very well and then go again and again. I'm deeply practical and deeply aware of the limitations of the practice, if you like. But it's better that than just capitulating to the system, saying it's all too impossible, it's all too difficult, because it is difficult. But there's great stuff happening, and let's grow the great stuff, and hopefully a growing consciousness the consciousness will grow and grow and grow to an extent becomes a tipping point, and we make macro decisions that are more in tune with community wealth building, and we won't see these egregious activities taking place anymore. But it's a slow, long burn.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of that evolution then that has occurred from, say, let's take the starting point as the Preston model.
Mm-hmm.
What were the lessons that you learned there? What has happened? How has community wealth building and its approach evolved over the past decade or so to adapt to both the macro circumstances, but also be able to adapt to the micro, the local. So if it is being applied to a city, inevitably every city is different and different demographics, different struggles, different challenges, although obviously there are the broader kind of top level ones that everybody's dealing with to lesser or greater extent, like climate change. So what has the evolution been then in terms of refining that process, in terms of implementation, adoption, uptake, and just an understanding of how community wealth building can be successful, how to make it successful and get more hooks, more barbs into the side of the behemoth?
Yeah, great question. I think it's matured in many ways, really, in terms of our understanding. One of the key theory of change maturing that's happened is that there's now a deeper understanding to creating the change. We need the movement of activists. I call them the wind. Yeah, they're the energy, and that needs to be created and developed and worked consistently. And perhaps in Preston, we didn't really have that movement. I'm talking about citizenry, and I'm talking about citizenry who might be fighting child poverty or gentrification, how they are on board with the wider economic system change and community wealth building agenda. So activism is really important. That girth, that groundswell, they are the wind, they're the energy, and we need to create them and work on them. The second thing I think we've learned is that practice, the show and tell, the community land trust, the good example of procurement, the community development finance initiative, those the show and tell, the things that actually happen, albeit small, are really, really important to capture the imagination of people. So the practice is important. We can start community wealth building tomorrow in a small instance, and we should be saying, that's a good thing. Let's sing from the rooftops of that success. So the movement, I think we've learned the movement is really important in creating that. The practice, the small instances, and actually proselytizing and talking about them. And of course, the policy environment, the policy landscape across the 5 pillars are important. So the movement is the wind. The practice, almost like the sails that can catch people's imagination, catch some of that energy and take us someplace. And then the policy and legislations like the hull of the boat, the structure of the boat. And we need all 3. And I think the Preston example was quite top down. It came from, if you like, the politicians. There was not a big movement around it. It's subsequently grown a bit of a movement, but not as much as possibly it could be. And the policy areas it's touched upon, it focused on procurement. It's now moved to the other elements, other pillars of community wealth building, but maybe latterly. So, in all of that, I think the big lesson is that this can't be top down. It has to be bottom up and top down, and curating the activism, curating those movement of folks who really want to make the difference. They are kind of key to keep that energy going, because the energy of citizenry, the energy of activists is potentially the only competitive advantage we have. Big corporates have a lot of the wealth and all the power. How do you counteract that? We counteract that through activism through citizenry getting pissed off and starting to fight for alternatives. That's the only we've got is numbers. We don't have the wealth and we don't have power, but we've got numbers. There's a lot of us. There's 99% of us compared to the 1%. That's significant. We need to use those numbers, and our activism is kind of key. I think that's for the next 5-10 years, we need to have greater activism in localities, in regions, and in nations around CWB, because that's a competitive advantage, and I think that will create a little bit more of a tipping point. Interestingly, some political parties have adopted community wealth building very strongly, including the Green Party, the Democratic Socialists of America. There's some political parties who have now standing on CWB tickets, and part of those tickets they're standing on has been driven by the activists forcing the politicians to have it in their manifestos and to start to proselytize and talk about it. That's certainly the key in St. Louis and Missouri, where activists is where it started, and now you've got candidates running for city and state who are advocating for CWB because of the power of the activists on the ground, because of that win, because of that energy, saying, look, we need an alternative economic system, let's do community wealth building, and they're adopting that programme as prospective or as actual politicians.
Yeah, and I suppose with the focus on activism, obviously there will be people who will lead a group, will push the agenda more than others, but I suppose another part of this process, or what's implied in all of this, is that we all need to become more active citizens. We need to counteract the atomization of society and start building the community and mobilizing, building those communities and feeling like we are part of a community instead of just standing alone, and nurturing that side of things. Because as you say, it's through the numbers, we're the 99%. And if more and more people can be mobilized and become active citizens, then the likes of community wealth building has greater potential to succeed. And it's dependent on that.
Yeah, I would say though that the active citizens, when I agree with you, but when I say, and I think what you're saying as well, when you say active citizens, we're not just talking it in a traditional representative or participative democratic form of active citizenry. We're talking about their activism in terms of economic democracy. We're talking about the community land trusts. We're talking about community ownership of buildings. We're talking about cooperatives. The economic democracy is probably even more important than the political democracy, if you like, or the work certainly hand in glove. And it's interesting. There is things working in our favour in this, because of the inabilities of prevailing politicians who are captured by power and wealth to actually deliver on cheap and affordable energy, on cheap and affordable housing. So the traditional political manifestation within capitalism is failing people, and people are starting to take things into their own hands. And so I think there is the weaknesses of the prevailing economic system are weaknesses, and they're something that works in our favour, because we have strength, because we know that a cooperative ownership of a wind farm is a much more effective way of producing energy, because the dividends won't be going to some private equity or some distance. The dividends come back to you, and they come back to you in probably in form of like cheaper bills. So there's things working in our favour by the very mechanisms of extractive fossil capitalism. So the activism is not just a traditional political democratic activism, it's an activism in terms of taking more control of your own economic lives.
Absolutely. And I think, recent events have revealed to more and more people the consequence of that process, in the sense of those countries or communities that embraced renewables have been more resilient and less impacted by the fluctuating price in oil. And that's becoming more evident that, it's inescapable to understand what the root cause of that is, and what the reason for their resilience and them being buffered from it is. So it's very stark And yeah, so these unfolding circumstances are revealing more and more the weaknesses, but more and more also the efficacy and the value in building that resilience and what form it can take, such as renewables, and building that sovereignty and the necessity to do that.
No, 100% that's right. And of course, what community wealth building does is it elevates all those beautiful forms of wealth retention and recirculation as one strategy. And it says it's not just singular, it's saying, look, we can actually build a whole economy around this. We can actually build a whole economic strategy around all of those different types of things you would do. The big worry I have sometimes is that people say in the community land trust movement, and increasingly in Scotland that's not the case, but they see community land trusts is like about community land trusts, and they're very focused on community land trusts without seeing them as a key plank of a wider community wealth building approach, a key plank of a wider economic system change approach. And sometimes people that are involved in some of the things we're talking about, as in like community land trusts, they're used to being seen as marginal, peripheral, fighting against the system. Yeah, I'm just focused on community land. That's my thing. I'm not, where actually it should be seen as one solution of a wider palette of solutions that is about building community wealth. And I think we need to raise our ambitions in terms of lots of these great stuff that's around, these little utopias of activity, and raise ambitions to think that, yeah, this could be the mainstream. We could have a whole of Scotland that's huge, 50% of Scotland on community land trusts. Why not? That's possible. Why not go for that? And I think we've got to raise our ambition, because we're never going to make the system change unless we scale up all the great little utopias, all those epiphanies of alternative possibilities. And community wealth building action plans and that framing creates that girth, it creates that force multiplier of all those small instances of great stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if people can't imagine it as being achievable, then it's going to be hard to realize it ultimately. So people need to believe, they need to understand what is achievable, that it is achievable, and trust that the necessary framework, the necessary foundations are in place to allow that to happen. But so in terms of comparing the likes of community wealth building and what it offers, how does that compare, and what are the contrasts? But also, is there any sort of competition, or is there commonality where they're complementary? The likes of the well-being economy, just transition, donut economics, which has been embraced by the likes of Amsterdam. Do these different reform agendas complement one another, or does it just cause confusion?
It's a good point, and they're all complementary. They're all sister movements, concepts, practices, and I'm using all those words intentionally. I think some are less practical. They're an aspiration. I think the well-being economy, I'm a big fan of the well-being economy. I think it's an outcome. But what we do on Monday is perhaps less clear. I think community wealth building is certainly it's an outcome, but it is more of a practical thing. We can actually get going this on Monday across elements, across the 5 pillars. It's very practical. It was devised to be something we can lodge straight away in a place and start to amplify. So they're all complementary. If there's a debate, and I'm in those debates all the time with colleagues, is that I don't see them in competition, but we are forced to be in competition sometimes by funders, by the gaze of senior politicians that maybe into donut economics more than into community wealth building. So we're kind of forced to be in competition and kind of sell our own wares. And I think that's a problem. It's part of the activism. It's part of the movement building. I think we need to be much more as generous as we can be with each other, but also see the limitations of our agenda. I don't think community wealth building is as strong on the outcomes as perhaps well-being economy is. I think it doesn't talk as much to what it actually feels like in terms of like well-being. I think that's a better conceptualization. I think donut economics is a perhaps stronger model when it comes to the whole ecological dimension in terms of the overshoot. I think that's a really useful model. Perhaps it's less in terms of the practical, what you do on Monday with donut. It's a great describer it's a great model, but how does that relate to practice? Though I know that Deal's getting a lot stronger on that kind of practice side. So yeah, no, they're sister. But as a movement, a collection of movements, we need to be generous and be aware that our own success may come with somebody else not succeeding because they've just not got the ear of a politician or a funder. The one thing that does need to happen right now is that some of the philanthropic funding that's around, the big philanthropic funders, when they say system change, they should mean real system change, not just a word to bandy around of changing within the Overton window of prevailing social democratic policies. Real system change means the game's a bogey, the game's off, it's complete system change. That means really looking to form the system. That means calling out capitalism. That means calling out the egregious behaviours of the 1%. That means that they are the enemy. You know, we're not going to build the system we all planet requires unless we actually call somebody out as the enemy. There is an other there, and those other are killing the planet. So I think we need to be more political and arsey, if I can use that phrase. And I think some funders seem to want their cake and eat it. And some of their statements around system change, I think, is less than system change. It's system change within the Overton window of the prevailing.
And do you think, again, that's maybe founded on a lack of imagination and just a lack of awareness of what's actually possible? So because of inevitably people are going to be influenced by the prevailing narratives and trying to break free from that and break free from their influence to have a better understanding of what is actually possible, you know, requires effort. And even if taking one of the 5 pillars of community wealth building in terms of like plural ownership, so cooperatives, employee-owned firms, I would say for a lot of people who have never had any sort of experience of that kind of democratic workplace or more egalitarian, empowering workplace, it'd be hard for them to imagine an economy, whether it's citywide or national, that is actually fundamentally based on that way of being.
Look, imagination and vision is kind of key, and that's how the stories are really important, the narratives of the successes and how co-ops can make a difference. All those are really important, I think, to create that consciousness. One of the things that I detect or perceive as a problem with alternative economic field and all the different organisations is that we need to stay in touch with those that are the real sharp edge of egregious extractive fossil fuel capitalism. I'm now no longer working class. Our usual circles are fairly middle class. I'm insulated against some of the worst excesses. That means the community wealth building movement needs to work hard in actually working with those that really are at the sharp end. And I think sometimes alternative economics, the alternative fields we're talking about, is the preserve of the privileged. And one needs to appreciate that we are privileged and work hard at engaging and working with people who are at the sharp end and not privileged. Martin Luther King said there is no justice unless there's economic control. And that's key. Economic control is everything. And us as alternative right-on activists, we are also part of the elite control mechanisms, and we've got to work hard to disabuse ourselves of that and working and be generous and humble and always work with those that are really at the sharp end. And I think the whole family of alternative movements need to be aware of who we are and our privilege, and also work really hard to engage with those that are at the sharp end. I'm not sure we always do that. I think there is a class race dimension to the world and to the world of alternatives, and we need to be very, very mindful and aware of that. Some of us are in elite institutions. Are we really the people to actually say this is what the alternative should be? I'm not sure. And I think we're a catalyst, but ultimately we need to work really hard to democratize, socialize our own activities. And that takes energy and time, but it takes an awareness, and we need to dig more into that awareness. I think it's going to be increasingly important moving forward. I don't want to be the spokesperson for community wealth building. I'm not the only one, but I don't want to be. It's not up to me. It's up for a whole range of activists and communities to actually be the spokesperson. I don't want to make a career about me being seen on community wealth building. That's not what it's about. This is about a much cascading distribution, democratization of an idea. I can help, but too many gurus, too many people who come up with a good model and think I'm going to sell this model. That's a very immature stage, and we need to get way, way beyond that.
Being conscious of that, has that then informed the evolution of community wealth building and how that's being promoted within Europe and beyond Europe? Is that something then that is part of the evolution, like focusing on inclusivity and understanding that potential power dynamic and ensuring that there is a more collaborative and participatory process of understanding what the needs are of a particular community?
Yeah. As I mean, look, there's many different catalyzing points for community wealth building. Some of them are politicians, some of them might be a large university, some of them might be a philanthropic funder, and you go with the energy because we're still in the foothills. But there is a significant move. We always say now, where is the movement? Where's the activism? We can't build this from the corridors of this elite institution. We need to actually see an action planning process and all that engagement, inclusive in the process of developing community wealth fund to be inclusive about it. And there's a number of activities we're engaged in where the seeding of community wealth building is coming from the activist community. It's also something we do talk about sometimes at TDC, but we don't tend to advertise that or make it showy. It's in the slow burn. It's in the activism on the ground. There's a number of places across the world where we've helped or assisted or have people embedded who are helping to build community wealth building on the ground with the people, with movement building, citizen organising stuff. And I think that's increasingly important to us, and it's been a conscious intention at Democracy Collaborative to not just do traditional think tank stuff, but actually to support through capacity and resources with grassroots organisation to start to agitate for community wealth building. And it's important that it's not done in a showy way. It's important that it's done stealthily. It's important that it's done in a way that for things to be made aware of and to things to make a big show, then straight away the forces of opposition get wind of it and start to quash it. So it's not in the interest in some instances to actually talk about it, which funders don't particularly like, because it's like they always want the best case study and they always want the example of, tell us about what's happening in X. It's like, well, I don't actually want to tell you what's happening in X at the moment because it's still working on the ground. And to tell you about it will actually motivate the wrath of those that don't want it. So there is a stealthy game to be played, and I think that comes hand in glove with this more inclusive, democratic, grassroots mobilization of CWB.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So looking ahead 5 to 10 years, what does success actually look like for community wealth building in Scotland and beyond, the wider movement? And what would you want our listener who's new to the whole concept to take away from this conversation?
Look, I don't know the pace things will take. It could be a tipping point and then whoosh, there's lots of more places and people and there's a whole range of stuff. We don't know the world is chaotic and crises might get so bad in the next 5-10 years that the search for alternatives gets even stronger and deeper. But I would hope that within the short to medium term, we start seeing significant test beds again. I think Scotland is an important test bed, and let's see how that goes. I'm sure there'll be trials and tribulations, stops and starts, but that's important that actually starts to work and starts getting really good outcomes. Really, today is working, but like growing, strongly. I think a big city would be good. I think Amsterdam's interesting. I think what's happening in New York City, we're talking to them about, they've got a community wealth building activity just starting through Mandani, the new mayor. That's fascinating. I think some of the stuff that's going on in South Korea is quite interesting. I'd like to see a big city, a big region, alongside Scotland, actually starting to adopt community wealth building, and it becomes mainstreamed as their economic development approach. I think that would do a lot in terms of increasing the pace and speed. Personally speaking, there was a long, slow burn of community wealth building from Cleveland to Preston to some of the earlier work in the United Kingdom, some of the other work in Richmond and Virginia in the US. A long, slow burn, about 10 years. Then there was, I think, a bit of a picking up the pace post Preston. If our inbox at Democracy Collaborative is anything to go by, there's been a bit of an exponential spurge. But even then, exponential is nothing compared to like what could be really exponential. There's been a bit of a spurt. I think that pace needs to go faster and stronger. So it's not just relatively exponential for us, but I think we need to think about the viral elements of being exponential, and we would hope through those test beds that work, that it becomes a crescendo of more and more interest. We are certainly at Democracy Collaborative as a small think tank muscling up a bit in terms of capacity and resources. I'd like to see in short to medium term significant philanthropic dollars put to this. And I'm talking, multiple millions. 50 million would be good. Something at that measure is probably something that a collection of people involved in community wealth building could probably manage at this point in time. Something of that magnitude would be really good within the next 5-10 years. A significant input of philanthropic capital so that we can actually start to get the better infrastructure, better reporting, better activism work. That would be good. At the moment, we're, in terms of community wealth building activity that's supported by philanthropic dollars, you're in the middle. You're in the, I don't know, not just for Democracy Collaborative, but collectively, probably in like 5-10 million across the world. That's nowhere near enough for economic system change work. We need that to be tenfold more in the short term. That's not a plea for funders. Yeah, we're okay. I can make our career, our organisation can be fine on what we've got, but actually to make the big difference, we need a tenfold increase.
And so, do you think Scotland, it's a level up from the likes of Preston, because it's at that national level, and it is this new test bed? Do you feel like it's getting enough attention to then help and feed that potential virality and that, uptake elsewhere? Because now people are saying, oh, wow, okay, this is viable on a national level. Obviously, it's early days, like the ink is barely dry. But are you hopeful that, and do you feel like there is enough attention being given to this new test bed and the potential, therefore, of greater uptake?
Two things on that. Firstly, is that there was already practice happening, there was already movement happening before the legislation. The legislation kind of created a hiatus, believe it or not, because the focus of attention was on the legislation, not the practice, not the movement. The movement was saying, okay, yeah, we'll keep on going, but wonder what the legislation will do. Practice on the ground was saying, yeah, we're doing some stuff, but we might have to do something different. We'll see what the legislation's got to say. So it created a little bit of a hiatus, ironically. And now we've just had parliamentary elections in Scotland. We've got new ministers. We've got a new government, new priorities. We're in a stage where we don't know exactly the veracity by which the government will take it forward. It's in the statute book. The same government that introduced it is now in power. We know there's ministers responsible for community wealth building, but that's all the gubbins. The real veracity we're yet to see. My call is that there's enough in the movement, there's enough practice, there's enough people who will keep on pushing, and then if the politicians slide or get a bit milk toast on it, we'll see. It's that evolutionary construction. Always go again, always go again. My call is that broadly is that I give it's a good chance. It's a good chance of growing and building, becoming more and more serious. I give it a 70-80% chance. I think the movement's there, the practice is there. The government, same government, seems quite keen on it. Some of the ministers that relate to it, I think are behind it. I think the First Minister's behind it. So I'll give it a good chance that we'll see something significant growing in Scotland in the short term. But although I've always got that bit of doubt, because politics, events, got to keep nurturing the activism. It's all hard work. But an 80% chance of it being a rip-roaring success.
Okay, great. Well, I really hope it is, yeah. And so just to close up, as you've pointed out, there has been this movement and it's been a slow burn to get to this point where it was legislated. And you've articulated how having that movement building, the activism there, the grassroots element of it is necessary, and that it needs to come from top down and bottom up at the same time. All these things are needed to be in place for community wealth building to reach that stage of where it might actually be written into legislation and and therefore, that hopefully a more comprehensive push at all levels, not just from the ground up. Do you feel like those elements are absolutely necessary? Because obviously in lots of communities, that's not going to necessarily exist. And so therefore the transition for community wealth building to really kind of become viral, that lead-in time would have to be reduced, would it not? In the absence of that movement already existing, has community wealth building over the past 2 decades dispersed all across the globe? And so already there are these kind of nascent, all this kind of potential there that just hasn't yet been realized and tapped into.
I think it's the latter there. I think there's nascent that's not been tapped into. Wherever I go in the world, they might not be talking community wealth building, but they're fighting against injustice. They're fighting against the oppressive nature of wealth and power. People are trying to fight back through a whole range of things that relate to the pillars of community wealth building, be it co-ops or whatever it may be. So there's no shortage of fight back and there's no shortage of activism. The thing that community wealth building offers is that force multiplier. It takes the specific into strategic economic strategy. And I think it can be a joiner, a coagulant, if I can use that term, and between different components in a place. Even somewhat, I've been involved in, people that are doing community land trusts, people that are fighting progressive procurement activities, people that are involved in local finance initiatives, people that are looking at cooperative development of a local retail. What you find is they're not joined together. They're doing their own thing, but they're not actually joined together under a comprehensive strategy. And I think community wealth building offers that glue. So I would disagree with you in the sense that, some places don't have that activism. I think all places has this activism, and it's growing because of the egregious effects of capitalism. What they don't have, what the variation is, in the extent to which they're joining forces under a strategic economic development approach, which is CWB. That's what needs to be. When I do my sales, and there is sometimes sales, my sales is when I go to a place I've not been before and somebody's invited me to go and talk and explore community wealth with them. My sales pitch is like, look, you've instigated this invite, you instigate this kind of work, but it's not just about you, it's about all the other people facing injustice in this place. How are you connecting with them? How are you building the movement? Because the movement can be brought together under the auspice of CWB.
Yeah, no, that makes sense completely, totally. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, it's been great to chat with you and explore community wealth building and all that it has to offer.
Thanks very much.